Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I am Pascal Chariot, the CEO of Enerdata, and I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar. We are together today with Morgan Crenes, whom some of you might already know, as we've been doing this exercise every year for a couple of years now, the head of our research and innovation data team at Enerdata. And this afternoon, we welcome also Richard Baron, the executive director of the 2050 Pathways platform, will be our guest speaker, and we'll ask him to comment the figures we will show, the analysis we make, and what he takes out of this, which will help the debate. So thank you, Richard, for being with us today. So we will start. Well, basically, you've been trained, as we have for the last year, how to use Zoom. So you are muted during this webinar, but you might ask questions through the Q&A box. We will look at the questions. Either if they are technical, we will answer directly by mail or by the chat box, or we will have a Q&A session at the end where we can comment the major issues or questions that you might have. This will last a little more than 1 hour. We have already had one this morning with more Asian people and one in French the other day. So we are very happy to share this information with you. And we will send you the document that we will use today. You will receive it by tomorrow, as far as I know. So basically what we will do there is, as we do every year, is to share you the information about last year's figures. But not only we will discuss the 2020 key figures, but also the 2021 estimates, as we did last year, by the way, which was a very specific year. And so today this year we'll do the same, both understanding or checking what occurred at the end of last year, but also what will be the rebound effects this year with the rebound effect on the economy, the decrease of the lockdown, etc. So Morgan will do this. He will share the key figures in terms of energy consumption, emissions, etc., but also the trends of the different energies for 2020 and 2021. Then I will present the trends and compare these historical trends or actual trends with medium and long-term objectives of the Paris Agreement objectives. And then handing over at the end to Richard to help us to debrief all this information to see what we can take out of this. So basically, we'll talk about different kind of figure of data, energy mix, emissions, energy sufficiency, energy efficiency, etc. Morgan, in the first part, will share the information about these last 2 years and basically what has been the COVID and economic crisis impact. And then I will look more at the trend for the future. What are we going for in the next years? And the question that we'll ask to Richard at the end is what is the good and what is the bad news in this, and what should we look at carefully in the coming months? So thank you again for being with us today, and I hand the floor to Morgan.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Pascal, for this introduction. I will share my screen and my presentation. Okay, so in this presentation, we'll start with a review of 2020 actual figures for energy and emissions, but also estimates for 2021. And I would like to thank the Energy and Statistics team which generated all those data. And before diving into all the figures, a few words about the methodology. So for 2020, we're speaking about actual data. So it's coming from the most recent national sources. And Enerdata's job was to ensure a good quality and coherency of all the data to be able then to do some comparisons across the year or countries. Then for 2021, now it's about estimations, and we reuse the methodology we developed last year when we wanted to know what will be the consequences of COVID-19 on 2020 energy consumption. And we try to improve this methodology, understanding the gap between 2020 actual data and 2020 estimates. So how it works, we try to make a link between macroeconomics projections such as GDP, industry value added, or traffic for transportation. And then we make this link with large energy sectors such as buildings, industry, transportations, but also power sector. So we do this for all G20 countries, and for the remaining countries, we have a more simplified approach, but we do take into account international bunkers, maritime and air. Okay, so let's start looking at the figures, and we'll start with the key figures for 2020 and 2021. In blue, you will have 2020 figures in this presentation, and in orange, you will have 2021 figures. So if we start with economic activity, GDP, you can see on the left that we had a big drop in GDP in 2020, minus 3.3%. And in 2021, we forecast a large rebound, more than 6%. And it does take into account the latest Oxford Economic scenario from May 2021, which includes the changes coming from the COVID outbreak in India that started in March. So you can see that in 2021, we expect to be above 2019 level. Now looking at energy, total energy consumption in the center, we'll have more or less the same variations than for GDP, except that rebound will be a bit less important. And in 2021, we should be more or less at the same level as 2019, sorry, the pre-crisis level. And now looking at the CO2 emission, energy-related emission, we have larger variations for this for emissions. We'll see why in the next slide. But we can also say that in 2021, the rebound won't be enough to exceed 2019 value. So here the figures are covering G20, which accounts for 80% of total global energy consumption. So now if we look at GDP, so economic activity, and we focus on the differences across region. What is interesting that in OECD, OECD was much more impacted than non-OECD region. So in OECD, we had a 5% drop in 2020, and we expect a 5% rebound in 2021, meaning that we'll be back on a 2019 level. For non-OECD region, it's a bit different. We have a moderate drop in 2020, minus 1.7%. And in China, we had a positive growth in 2020. And we expect a large growth in 2021, plus 8%. Now, if we look at total energy consumption, no surprise, there is a strong link with GDP variation. For OECD, we do not expect to exceed 2019 level in 2021. China had a positive growth in energy consumption in 2020. And if we focus on the dot line about past trend in the past decade, you can see that in the US or EU, we have a stagnation or a slight decrease of energy consumption coming from moderate economic growth, but also energy efficiency efforts. And this is what we look at in the next slide, since we have represented energy intensity indicator, which is a very good indicator to track energy efficiency progress at a very global level. So what is energy intensity? This is a ratio between energy consumption and GDP, meaning that when energy intensity is decreasing, you can have more GDP with the same amount of energy consumed. Now, if we look at the graph on the right side of this slide, you have the energy intensity evolution for G20 for the past 2 decades, and you can see that in average, we have a decrease, a 2% decrease every year, which is good. It means that we have some progress in terms of energy efficiency, but at the same time, it's very far from the target to be on track on a 2 degrees pathway, which would require, sorry, a minus 3.5 decrease every year. Now, if we look at 2020, it's quite specific this year because we had a recession, and you can see that energy intensity improvement stopped in 2020. We do not have a strong evolution, and this is something normal, standard during recession time, because for transportation, all the trucks are still traveling the same distances, but with less goods inside the trucks. In the industry, all the machinery, the processes are not operating at nominal level, so it decreases a little bit efficiency. So that's why dynamic was not improving in 2020. But if we look at 2021, we should go back to the historical trend, more or less, meaning that following 2020 and 2021, there is no specific change coming from the crisis. Okay, now looking at CO2 emission. So 2021 emission level should be 1% below 2019 level. We had a big drop in 2020, larger than for GDP or energy consumption, which is also which is coming from the fact that energy sector, the most impacted, are also carbon intensive sector. So it's coming from transportation, which use a lot of oil, mainly oil, and also power generation with a drop in coal power generation. And why we have that? It's because electricity demand dropped in 2020, meaning that we need less flexible power plant to match and to satisfy demand. We can use more must-run or fatal production, such as hydro, nuclear, or renewable. So that's why we have this big drop in CO2 emissions in 2020. But also we expect a large rebound in 2021, but not as much as the drop. And why? It's simply because in 2021, transportation will be still strongly impacted by COVID-19. So if you look at the historical trend in on the graph on the right side, you can see that from 2013, there are no big variations of CO2 emissions. Some year is decreasing a little bit, other year it's increasing. And if you take 2020 and 2021 as a whole, we have a small decrease, which is very far from what we need to be on track on -2 degrees trajectories, since we would need a -4.5% decrease every year. And you can see that the light green bar in this graph is quite similar to the drop in 2020. So it means we need a shock similar to COVID-19 shock experience in 2020. Okay, so now we will move to the other part of 2020 and 2021 figures, looking at individual energy carriers. So in this dashboard, you can look at the second line with individual energy figures. And what we can say that oil was very impacted compared to the energy, which is not a surprise with transportation, very impacted as well. Then we have coal. We mentioned that coal power generation was strongly impacted in 2020. Gas was moderately impacted. We'll see why in the next slide. And electricity, it's a bit different since we will have a significant growth in 2021. And in 2021 will be significantly at higher level compared to the pre-crisis level. So if we focus on coal, what can we say? Coal is driven by China. 60% of coal consumption in G20, and we had a big decrease in 2020, coming from half of the decrease can be explained by power generation. This is what I mentioned earlier. The other part is coming from decrease in some specific industry sectors such as cement, steel, especially in China, Asia, and in OECD we have also competition from gas in power generation. In the US, for example, with very low gas price. In the EU, we had also significantly high carbon price. And overall, in OECD, we have also a phase out from coal. So that's why we had this big drop. And in 2021, we expect a large rebound driven by Asia, China, and coming in large part from power generation. So now if we look at oil, we have a big impact for oil. We mentioned that. Globally, oil, if we look at the past trend, is increasing in G20, 1% per year. It's relatively stable in OECD, and in non-OECD countries, it's increasing significantly, more than 3% per year. China experienced a growth in oil consumption in 2020, which is not the case for most countries in G20. And that's why now China is just behind the US with 23%, sorry, of total oil consumption in G20 compared to 24% for the US. So what's driving those variations for oil? It's mainly transportation. Transportation accounts for more than 50% of total oil consumption. And in this slide, you can see the variation of energy consumption in transport. And the variations are huge compared to what we have seen previously. At G20 level, drop in transport energy consumption reached 11% in 2020. And in the US, it was even more, 13%, because in the US, transportation plays a huge role in the economy. We have a very developed domestic air transportation. And now if we look at 2021, there will be a rebound, but it's not the same in all countries. In the EU, for example, it would be relatively moderate, with still impact of COVID-19, especially in the first half of 2021, and some uncertainties for the rest of the remaining of the year, sorry. And at the end of 2021, we won't be back on 2019 level, and we do not know exactly when we'll go back because it's very dependent on COVID-19 sanitary measures. Now, if we look at international transportation, maritime bunker, international maritime transportation was not really impacted, minus 1% in 2020, plus 1% in 2021. It's not the case at all for international air transportation. Energy consumption was half in 2020, minus 45%. And we expect a moderate rebound, only 17%. So the figure is huge, but it's not enough at all to go back to pre-crisis level. Okay, so now let's move to gas. So for gas, it's a fuel experiencing a good increase in the past decades, plus 2% per year at G20 level. We can see that we had a moderate variations in 2020 in OECD countries. We had very low gas price. I mentioned it, especially in the EU and the US. In non-OECD, and especially in China, we had a large growth in 2020, coming from substitution from coal to gas, power generation, for instance, but also climatic conditions with a cold winter. And in G20, we expect a plus 2% increase in 2021. It will be driven by China and Asia. We can also see that in the US, we expect a stagnation since gas prices should be relatively high in 2021. Then we have electricity. Electricity consumption has been increasing significantly in the past years, more than 3% per year at G20 level. Different reasons behind that. We have globally growing economy, but also change in the structure of the economy. For example, in China, we have an expansion of services which rely much more on electricity. And we have also electrification of uses, energy uses. And this is what you can see on the graph on the right side with the dot line for G20. You can see that the share of electricity in the final consumption has been steadily increasing for the past 2 decades, starting from 16% in 2000 and now reaching in 2021 almost 22%. So now if we look into the future, you know that we'll need a much higher share of electricity in final consumption, together with decarbonized power generation mix to reach 2 degrees target or Paris Agreement objectives. So we expect after the 2020 moderate rebound drop, we expect a large rebound in 2021, plus 5%. And how we can reach and satisfy all this increasing demand? Basically, it's coming from fossil fuel currently. You can see on the left side that we have a huge part of the power mix coming from coal in gray and natural gas just above in blue. Now, if we look at the share of fossil fuel in the graph on the right side, you have the dot line, which accounts for the share of fossil fuel in the power mix generation. You can see that it has been decreasing from 2010, and we had a big drop in 2020. But this is a one-off effect. This 1.7 percentage point drop, which is the highest, the biggest in the 21st century. It's just a one-off effect with this big drop in coal power generation. I mentioned it earlier. And in 2021, we expect a big rebound for coal power generation. So fossil fuel share should still decrease a little bit, but not at the same pace as in 2020. And we will be very far from the 2 degrees pathway. Now, if we are looking at the good news, we had a strong growth of renewables, solar PV and wind in 2020 and 2021. China accounted for two-thirds of new capacity installed in 2020 for wind. And there is a very specific trend in China in 2020, since there will be the end of government support for wind. That's why we have many projects coming in line commission in 2020. And we expect a decrease in installed capacity for wind in 2021, but will still be at very high level compared to 2019. And now for solar PV, we have a good acceleration. 2020 was much higher in terms of new installed capacity. 2021 we should have even more, and which is a good news. China accounted for a bit less than 50% of new installed capacity in 2020. Overall, in the short term or mid-term, we do not see a strong impact of COVID-19 crisis or economic crisis on investment in those technologies. Okay, so now we can go to the takeaways and key messages from this presentation about 2020 and 2021 figures. On the macroeconomic side, what we can say is that we had a big drop in 2020 and we'll have a large rebound in 2021, but it's very different across the countries and regions. Non-OECD countries were a bit less impacted than OECD countries. And in 2021, we still have large and big uncertainties. A good example is India, which required a big revision of GDP forecast following this COVID outbreak in March. Then if we look at consequences on energy and energy sector, we can say that transportation was very impacted, especially international transportation and air transportation. Then we had in 2020 a big impact on coal power generation, but it was more a one-off effect with a rebound expected in 2021. And also tertiary sector services have been impacted, especially by lockdown and teleworking, with a switch to residential sector in terms of consumption. Now looking at structural trends, the good news coming from renewables with a good growth in 2020 and good expected growth in 2021 with no or limited impact of the crisis, some delays in some countries. And now if we step back and if we look at long-term objective, long-term decarbonization objective, and if we look at those indicators such as energy intensity or carbon factor, what we can say is that the crisis did not impact those indicators when we look now at 2021, and if we compare where we are, where we will be at the end of 2021 compared to 2019 before the crisis, we are on the same trend as before, and unfortunately, those trends are not enough to meet the target from Paris Agreement. Okay, so that's it for this first part of the presentation, and I will leave the floor to Richard.
Thank you very much, Morgan. And these are indeed, as we say too often, sobering messages from a climate perspective. My organization, the 2050 Pathways Platform, is particularly interested in the CO2 aspects of the picture, which are, of course, super closely linked to the energy trends. And I must say, this is really important information to those of us that consider how to engage an effective transition to a global net zero by the middle of the century. And I should add that this is the kind of energy sector understanding that I think should be made more broadly understood by the climate policy community. So I was trying to grab at some of the positive messages and trying to compare numbers in the slides that you showed. And I was seeing with some interest that the GDP growth is in fact going to be faster in 2021 than the CO2 growth, but you actually quickly explain why that is and why we shouldn't expect to, or maybe shouldn't expect that to be structural. I mean, at the same time, I don't think we should be overly surprised not to see a stronger decoupling. And I may ask, could it be any different? It is not good news, of course, but it was not a year, 2020 was not a year where, with the best intentions, countries could have installed much new alternative low carbon infrastructure. And I think it's the same with the private sector. In a deep recession, the ability to invest and explore new avenues to decarbonize were, of course, limited by the lack of available resources. One exception to that, of course, and you said that very well, is in power generation in the more vibrant economies, with the growth of installed power capacity in PV and wind in particular. So I think, to me, a lot of it will depend on the nature of and the effectiveness of the recovery packages. I wouldn't want to call them green recovery packages, because from now on, I think recovery packages should be overwhelmingly going towards the green. Otherwise, we're missing the point. If you're just focusing on the green sectors, you're going to miss the point of what the transition is about. So, for instance, you could look at what is the US going to do. They talk about building back better, but the question to us is, how cleaner is it going to get? It will take a massive effort to decarbonize the infrastructure sector, other than power generation, of course, where the solutions are more economic already. But in the meantime, I was seeing a 12% expected growth in coal use in power gen in 2021 in the US. Very surprising indeed, but I think you explained well the underlying factors, and there's much growth in also in the other installed capacity there. So in terms of what I would watch out for next year is whether there will be a significant rebound in global trade, for instance, and the associated energy consumption. Could that be an indication of any relocation that we might see in some of the value chains? Let's wait and see. I'm also interested in seeing any lasting behavioral change on the so-called sufficiency aspects, which I think the crisis has allowed to reveal some of the potential with telecommuting and so on. Of course, it would be easy to read too much in the air transport aspects that you showed. Some will say that the reopening of the borders will bring us back to normal, but it sounds from the air companies' report that themselves don't think so, because corporate travel might actually be significantly and structurally impacted, because we've actually started experiencing better alternatives, such as the one that we are using today. So one other question that I would have is, how structural and impactful will the home working be? And I wondered to what extent, in fact, the shortness of the lockdown in China did not allow that country to fully experiment with what we've been stuck with in our countries, where for the whole year we had to work from home. And so I'm wondering whether we are getting a head start on some of the solutions that came out of that. I would have one question which might sound anecdotal, but on gas in China. I was wondering if you're seeing an increase in coal-based gas. It's been a worry in the international community as China was making a priority of air quality control in cities. But to some of the industrial consortiums in China, that meant getting gas synthesized out of coal and getting that gas used in cities. I'm not sure you're seeing that right now. I was wondering if there is any sign of that in the statistics that you have. But loads of interesting information here. I will stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. You already began, by the way, to comment things about the future that we will discuss now. Maybe Morgan will try to find some answer to your question, and we'll answer to at the end. So we'll switch to the second part, which is what's happening now. What might be happening in the near future. So here you have a graph with the emissions, the CO2 emissions from the energy sector, including the industrial processes, which is about 65–70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions at the world level. So you see there what just Morgan just commented on the historical trend that the emissions are growing, and that the fall in 2020 and the rebound in 2021 are mostly conjunctural. So then the question is about the future. So we'll take it starting from 2050 and discussing whether the objectives that are under discussion now about net zero emission by 2050 are consistent with a scenario going to a 2-degree trajectory and 2-degree temperature increase by the end of the century. Then we'll look at 2030 and whether the new objective, the increasing targets, more demanding targets, are consistent with this long-term objective. And then we'll discuss the more short-term actions, including the recovery plans that Richard just started to comment. Here you have the three scenarios that we have there are the Enerdata scenarios, which are named here in the legend. Enerbase is a kind of business as usual scenario with the ongoing trends, existing policies. Enerblue is a scenario based, so Enerbase would basically lead to above 4 degrees, sorry, temperature increase. The NR Blue scenario is based on the indices which were published after the COP21, so in 2015, 2016. And this is leading to, let's say, overall stability of the energy emissions that would lead to over 3 degrees increase. And then the third one is the NR scenario that we built, which is one scenario that enables to maintain the temperature increase under 2 degrees at the end of the century. It's not a 1.5, it's under 2 degrees at this stage. So first point, if we start with 2050, we see that this requires, the NR scenario basically requires a radical change of trends, which means in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it is not just a slight change, it is a huge decrease, because we would need to divide by 4 the emissions, which means, as Morgan commented, about 4.5% per year. If the economy grows by 2.8, it means a real decoupling, as Richard mentioned, of the carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, compared with the activity. 7% per year decrease is a real huge decoupling, while we have been used to have 1 or 2% max every year. So this is a huge change, which would come both by a great change in the energy system, decreasing the fossil fuel. This is a graph over there. We could have the other side of the coin with the increased participation of renewables or carbon-free technologies. So of course, this would be quite radical in the coming decades, but also through a big change in the primary consumption, in the energy consumption, primary or final, doesn't matter. And these come through both energy efficiency and energy sufficiency plans. Just to define it clearly for the next slides, energy efficiency means using the same service but consuming less energy. It's typically, if you change your boiler at home, it's more efficient, but you have the same temperature level, fine. Or you change your car, instead of 6 liters per 100 kilometers, you go to 4 liters. This is more efficient, but you have the same service. Energy sufficiency is consuming less services. So it's changing the temperature. Instead of having 21 degrees in your house, you go to 19 or 20. Or it's using your bike or staying at home to work instead of using your car to go to work. So that's just a definition, and we need definitely both. Now, when we look at don't read the slide so much, when we look at the 2050 objective, many countries are now talking about zero net emission. At the end of the day, so we went through a number of countries and working, by the way, with countries, including with Richard's organization on this. Basically, going to net zero emission by 2050 is a very ambitious objective. It has many positive points, like looking at all sectors, looking at also the LULUCF, land use, forestry policies, and food policies. And this is consistent with the long-term objectives of staying under 2 degrees. So when the countries, at a country level, companies, etc., it's quite different. But when we talk about net zero emission in 2050 for OECD countries, and in 2060 for large non-OECD countries like China or India, this is consistent with staying under 2 degrees. Then we could discuss 1.5, etc., but this is really consistent, which is fine. It is consistent with this trend. So that's a good news, basically, as many countries and more countries are committing to this. Of course, then you need to have real action plans, etc., to do this. But if countries begin to commit on 2050, and then there is no more discussion on 2050, and the question is, what do we do now to go for this? The second stage is 2030, the objective for 2030. So that's where the NR Blue scenario that we have here which was done based on the previous indices, was having 2 limited targets, which would lead over 3 degree increase. The new indices that have been published in 2020, or which are under discussion now, show progress. So that's quite interesting, but it feels only a part of the gap with the 2 degree scenario. So that will be interesting to see what will be coming in the US, in other countries, in the coming weeks or months, so that this gap decreases and that the new objective for 2030 are closer to a 2-degree or under 2-degree trajectory. And then we go to the more short term. What can we expect? Morgan just showed the trends, the actual figures. The question is, what can we expect now? And typically the recovery plans is a key point, because there is a huge amount of money, there is a huge opportunity not to do business as usual. And I encourage you to go to the Vivid Economics analysis there, because it's what we use. They are going on a regular basis, updating this analysis on the G20 countries. And what showed the last analysis they made is that most of the recovery plans are not contributing, or might potentially contribute to in a negative way to the climate change. So that's the bad news. The good news is that it's improving. It is challenged, and countries have, in some countries it has improved, like in the US typically, in China and so on, and that there might be new upgrades in the coming weeks and so on. So that's a key point, how much this can still continue to be improved in the coming weeks, in the coming months, so that the recovery plans, where there are hundreds of billions, go to also contribute to the climate change mitigation. Then, if we look globally at what we should look at in the coming months and years, when we do the scenarios, the long-term scenarios in terms of full decarbonization of the activities, it goes through different levers. So one, obviously, it goes through the policies. So there should be a rise in the ambitions. There should be short-term policies. There should be actual figures showing that it's moving. Another area are the energy systems. Obviously, it's about decreasing the fossil fuels, increasing the carbon-free capacities. But also, as Morgan mentioned, there is a huge stake at increasing the speed of electrification of end users. Electrifying end users brings both a better efficiency and the potential to decarbonize the source, globally the energy, because electricity can be decarbonized. But it already brings, when you go to an electric car, when you go to electricity in electrical motors in the industry, etc., it begins by saving a lot of energy. So energy efficiency is coming there. And Morgan commented that we moved from 17% in 2000 to 22% of electricity in the final use. And in 2050, we should be at 40 to 50%, which means an acceleration of the electrification rate. Of course, this energy system evolution also takes into account hydrogen, CCS, and other technologies, some of them being already mature, some of them which could be questioned. Well, then we need to have a real sectoral approach, and not only in all the usual sectors as building, transport, etc., but including agriculture and food, and the land use and forestry evolution. When you take into account the complete greenhouse gas emission picture, this is key. And there are many countries, by the way, like developing countries, Africa, etc., where this part is very, very important. Both in terms of food, agriculture, but also in terms of land use and people behind with this. Another area is the decrease of consumption, which is not tackled as much as the decarbonization of the energy systems. I come back to this. The other one being the different stakeholders. It's not only about the country governments or international governments or COP, it's also at the corporate level, at the investors level, at the citizens, and at the regional or local level and local authorities. All the stakeholders that we are, at the end of the day, have their part into this transformation. And then the question is how to monitor these different things. Some indicators are easy to have about fossil fuels, typically electrification. Then if you look at energy sufficiency, behaviors, investors, etc., it's not always so obvious. It's what we're trying to tackle better every time. Then almost the last slide about the IEA roadmap, which has been published recently, which is a very interesting exercise that the IEA did, quite different from their past approach. So there is a huge change there. And we have on the left side of this slide just noted all the positives that come out of this, because there is a huge rise in the ambition. The ambition there is to be neutral in emissions for the energy sector and industry sector, which is very ambitious. So of course it requires a lot of CCS and so on, which can be discussed, but, and that's the IEA message has been very strong, it goes and it promotes a very sharp decrease in fossil fuels, a sharp increase in carbon-free capacities, and electrification of end uses. Then it takes into account a number of new technologies. So one can question how much is it reliable to count so much on CCS, on hydrogen, etc., whether it will be competitive. And it's very much focused on decarbonizing the sources. So that's where we believe at Enerdata and with other organizations that there are other areas that needs to be tackled at the same time, energy sufficiency being one of those. Behaviors at a personal level, but also at a company level, at a country level, and how to reduce this. And with other approaches, of course, the agriculture and food, which IEA might not take into account, but it's key there. Burden sharing among countries is also a key question when how to split the efforts and who will have which part of the objective into going to net zero emission, but also into financing the transition in countries. And one approach which is also key is to think about it not in local emissions only, which is all what the statistics do. All the COPs are just about how much emissions you have in your own country, but having a carbon footprint approach is more about how much do your economy, your activity, your lifestyle consumes, whatever you are producing it locally or importing goods from other countries. And obviously that is challenging mostly in developed countries because we import, France typically would import half of its footprint from abroad and only half of it being produced locally. So if I come to my conclusion or wrap-up message there, so with what Morgan commented, the trend in the emissions is far from being in line with the Paris Agreement. That's well known. The impact of 2020, 2021 and this crisis is primarily conjunctural. There is no change in the fundamentals. Then, third point is that beyond transition, we are really talking about required breakthrough, and breakthrough are required at different levels. It's obviously about decarbonizing the energy system, but it's also about the demand, the energy demand, both on the efficiency side and the sufficiency side. Then on the paper, we are doing scenarios with different countries, etc. We've been doing this for years, many others do. We know how to do it, which is a good news, by the way. There are solutions which are not new technologies to be invented, etc. It's about putting the right policies, efficiency together, decarbonizing, and putting the money in front of us. So the good news is that we know how to do it. The other good news, well, technically speaking, the other good news is that the long-term objectives now are beginning to be very consistent with this, which is a good step forward. Then, where it's half empty or full is that the 2030 targets remained insufficient, basically, and more worrying that the current trends and the current policies, including the new decisions, are still quite far from accelerating this transition or this breakthrough. That's where we will give the word to Richard now to help us to take out of this the positive and negatives and what we should follow in the next months or a couple of years.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for those. And it's great to see that Enerdata is adding its voice and its scenarios, I think, with so much uncertainty that we have ahead of ourselves on this, and especially in the big choices that have to be made. It's great to have different organizations representing different mindsets, putting numbers out. So thank you very much for that. Just to say that my work in the 2050 Pathways platform, including with organizations like Enerdata, is to look at long-term low emission development strategies as part of the Paris Agreement. So really helping out countries to look at how to decarbonize, and very much adopting the same view, to help them look at a potential net zero objective down the line and work back to see what this might mean in current decision points. So I think it's important in that context to come back to the what's on paper now, and with the declarations that you haven't listed, and I think most people know them, but I'd like to maybe be a bit comprehensive on that. So we've seen announcements from China, from the US, from South Korea, from Japan. We've seen the EU shifting its 2030 goal from 40% to 50%, and then Germany from 2050 to 2045. I'd like to add to that countries like Indonesia, which is often under the radar, but is a country with a potential to have emissions in 2050 that would be between 2 and 4 billion tons of CO2 if we don't pay attention. A country that is now considering decarbonization to 2060 or 2070. And to add to that, because that's only their government stance at the moment, and we'll have to see what comes out of it, but their own utility has declared that they would decarbonize by 2050, and no new coal projects will move forward after 2023. So there are some signs like these that indicate that there might be a bit of a domino effect that we have to look at, and that gives us hope that things are going to move faster than the 2% annual decoupling that you were talking about. So what we need, of course, is clear plans on what exactly those goals mean, and that's what we are in the business of. The idea is really to look at those plans and see how in the near term they bring actual changes in policies. That's the idea of the Paris Agreement ambition cycle. I mean, you could look at a number of areas where you see interesting things happening. Recently, I was looking at green steel initiatives, for instance. I mentioned earlier that it was super hard to see how infrastructure investment in the coming year would be any different from what it was before, but I'm seeing a number of countries that are now turning around and saying, okay, we need to actually significantly help and put policies in place to decarbonize those hard to abate sectors. And we are putting in place discussions on public procurement, including via the Clean Energy Ministerial. And there are a number of agreements that are starting to pop up along those lines because countries, I think, realize that they have similar challenges at domestic level, and heavy industry is one. Among the countries that I think we should be looking at as well, which actually don't give me as much hope as they should, is those third tier countries. So I mentioned Indonesia, the countries slightly outside the door of the G20, like Vietnam and Nigeria, who, if left unchecked, will really quickly go to the 1 billion tons of emissions. I'd like to tell you a number, and that is that Nigeria, under current demographics, would be the largest populated country in the world by 2100, more populated than China and India, largely because those countries are going to lose population. But there are, places in the world where this issue is not being addressed and embraced as much as we'd like, and it's important to look at them as well. Coming back to the issue of sufficiency and efficiency, I completely agree. There is much too much support and emphasis to the work on the big blocks, which are on the supply side. And one question for me, who's been working on climate policy for too many years now, is to what extent the new generations now will be implementing radically different behaviors in the coming decades, because this is the generation that has grown in a world where climate change has always been on the news, as is increasingly being taught at school, is a constant issue. And it's almost impossible to envision that they would behave the way our parents, and including myself when I was young, did. So the question is whether the current crisis is about to trigger that sort of change. And is it a change we're only going to see in modernized economies like the OECD, or is it something that might be more pervasive? Shifting completely to the other side, but not to say that what I just talked about is not important. I think it's critical, and there's too little investment in that space. I was also hearing recent weak signals about hydrogen development. I was hearing that in the Gulf states alone, 32 gigawatts are going to be installed in renewable energy just for the purpose of hydrogen production. And to me, that triggers thoughts about, is the energy sector making a strong shift that we're not paying too much attention to, but that seems to be ramping up. So that might be on the positive side, but monitoring a bit of the corporates, investment in that space gives us pause as to what the business of energy projections might look like a few years ahead, with hydrogen taking over, maybe. We see this in discussions in countries like Morocco, and Erdera has worked with us in that space, where they look at this as a prospect for being able to access EU markets, as the EU is changing its tack on trade by looking at the content of trade. And so Morocco is interested in developing, value chains that are going to be decarbonized, and hydrogen is part of that. Another one that you didn't mention, Pascal, and I know it's something that you and I have seen, is this issue of water desalination that seems to be picking up in lots of parts of the world, and more so in places where climate change is going to hit hard. That's going to create new energy demand. It's often said, yeah, you might probably be able to pick that up with new renewable install capacity. I'm just wondering if in this nexus, there's going to be interesting opportunities or not, but this is to me an area that I think needs a bit of investment as well. Now, one thing that might be strange is what I'm going to say now. I think we are quite interested ourselves to look at the institutional changes that are underway. You're giving us the physical picture, and the physical picture looks bad. It looks like it could improve, but generally it looks bad. But what we want to look at as well is what countries are putting in place that might indicate that there might be a structural policy change underway. For instance, China just a few days ago created a leaders group with ministers from finance, et cetera, the NDRC, which is the lead ministry there, with a goal under the guise of a vice premier to say, your job now is to implement the 2030 peak and the 2060 decarbonization. That's part of your job now. Bon, it's a group of people meeting in a room. You might not put too much attention to this, but to those who are close observers of China, that means this has suddenly ramped up in terms of rank in the list of priorities in the country. In the EU, for instance, just a couple of hours ago, there was a leak of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, to me, because this is a question that has been in discussion for more than 20 years, I think, in the EU, as the EU was starting to look at carbon pricing, this is an indication that the EU now means business when it comes to decarbonizing its industry, and that there is going to be this new additional cost put on industry, and that if you want to do business inside the EU, mind you, you will need to have that same cost on your imports for those heavy industries. That to me is an indication that we're shifting gear in a way, and it's not just an institutional change, it's a policy change. I'd like, if I have a minute, maybe to answer the question by Marcelo Lando on whether I think we will manage this without a global carbon price like that of the ETS. I think we should turn the question around. I should ask, do we think we can get to net zero without a massive rollout of electric vehicles? And do we think we can get to net zero without a massive decarbonization of electricity? And the answer, I think, would be no. We need much more. We need sufficiency. We need people to shift to different modes of transportation. But overwhelmingly, we see in scenarios that these are some of the solutions that come forward. And do we see in the way those solutions are being pushed out a major role of the carbon price? I think in the EU, overwhelmingly, the renewable penetration has not been driven by the carbon price. I think the electric vehicle penetration as we see it today has not been driven by the carbon price. But I think there's a bit more of a philosophical change that we need to implement here. 20 years back, and I was working with Erdera back then on a low carbon scenario globally. And that low carbon scenario was looking at minus 50% by 2050, because back then the science was not as strong as it is today. And now, so we were looking at CO2 as an externality and how to best achieve that minus 50% goal. You price it and you move some of it out, you keep some of it because otherwise it's too expensive. I think we've moved from that picture to a picture where CO2 is now being declared as a global toxic. We want it zero. We want it zero by 2050. It's not immediate. We will give ourselves some time. We don't have that much time, but that's the rationale. We need to push it out. And so we see governments who are taking bans on internal combustion engine vehicles, for instance. They're not saying, well, let's see, how much we could accommodate. They say, no, we're telling industry this is no longer the option. We need to go to another technology that's net zero. Of course, I think the carbon tax has a role to play. We have to have a constant push to move some of the people away from that fossil fuel consumption. But I think we also need to be mindful of the effects this has on distributional impacts. We've seen this with the yellow vest episode in France, and I think other countries are going to face the same when they push up those gasoline prices. So an interesting part of this is that the carbon tax can be used to actually offset some of those effects with distributional of, redistributive systems, but you have to face the pushback as people have to absorb the excess cost. So my short answer to your question is that I don't think a global carbon price should be a priority. I think there are many more areas where countries can collaborate, and on the basis of the insights that Enerdata and others put forward, to actually move ourselves away from carbon. But I'll leave here, thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Very interesting. It is good because we had 3 webinars with 3 guests and various inputs, which is very interesting to us also. So maybe at the end, we'll try to share it all together. So there is a number of questions going on at the same time. Morgan, do you want to answer a couple of the questions that would be in your expertise?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pascal. Yeah, there is a good point from Dan Plechati. Sorry for the pronunciation. So this question is about emissions. After accounting for non-G20 countries, would you project that energy-related CO2 emissions in 2021 will roughly equal emissions in 2019? Would this imply that we would expect 2022 to set a new record for CO2 emissions, absent any break in current trends? So I think there are 2 questions. The first one is, what happens if we add non-G20 countries for 2021? The answer is that it won't change a lot the trend. So when you add the non-G20 countries and you look at global world level, you have the same trend as for G20, meaning that you have a larger drop in 2020 compared to the rebound in 2021. But basically, even if we are a bit below 2019 level, it means that there is no big change in 2021 when compared to 2019 level. And then the other part of the question is, what will happen in 2022? Do we expect a new record for CO2 emissions? And here the answer is I would say what is the most important is maybe it's not to know if we have reached a peak or not. It's to look at the right indicators. And I think for decarbonization, it's carbon factor and energy intensity. So I mentioned it in the presentation. And unfortunately, there is no change. If you look at this, after the rebound in 2021, we are going back on track on historical trend, and there are no reasons for 2022. So it's tomorrow, 2022, to have a big change for those indicators. So it means that at the end, the last parameter to know if we'll have a new record for CO2 emissions or not is GDP. If we have a large GDP growth, we could say that we will have a big increase in CO2 emission. If we have a moderate GDP growth, maybe we'll have a decrease in CO2 emission. And maybe another question from about renewable energy. Are you satisfied with development in renewable energy? What we can say is that in the past 2 years, and even what we can expect in 2021, we have an acceleration in capacity installed, which is good. But what will be important is to know, to understand if this trend can continue in the future to reach all the potential required to have a large installed capacity in 2030 and 2050. Because one of the big options to decarbonize the economy is to have a large increase in the share of electricity in final consumption. So we will need electrification, but the other side of electrification is decarbonization of the mix. So I would say that if we look at the recent trend, it's okay, but the concern is more what we can achieve in the future, in the next 5-10 years.
I can continue maybe to answer a couple of questions. Try to make it short because then we might have to stop sometime. There is another question about for some countries being negative would mean reducing emissions could be to finance it in other countries. So first point is that when we say typically that the EU, the European Union, should be zero net emission in 2050, which is now a commitment, it doesn't mean that every single country could be or should be zero net emission, because basically all the countries do not start from the same starting point and do not have the same potential. France typically in this context should be a negative emission country in 2050, because in France we enjoy having a lot of forests and a high potential for natural capture of CO2 emissions, and also starting from a low level of emissions due to our electrical system. So that's a point. And Nordic countries typically are already committed to be negative, also due to their nature, etc., and capacity of sinks, natural sinks in these countries. So that's a first point. Then, and that's what is key to me, what we learned in the last years, is that going to these objectives needs really to cover all the emissions, all sectors, before thinking about financing the others. And I'm not an expert of the CDM, which has been discussed in Kyoto, etc., but you have the same risk with the compensation at the company level, etc., which at the end of the day, in terms of accountability, and you don't find it back. So a lot of people finance it in another place of the world. At the end, we are still continue to increase deforestation at a global level, etc. So yes, at the end, sometimes, of course, there are some potential transfers of loads or support of financing, because it's more intelligent at some time that 1 million euros instead of what could be much more efficient in other countries. But it should begin by every single country doing all what it can in terms of decarbonization, efficiency, etc. Otherwise, everybody would just mention, I finance it in another place. It has not been so successful. And going to these zero net emission objectives, to me, is first look at your own issues or stakes. And I can comment about, not a pro about Bangladesh, etc. When we look at the global picture, it's what I mentioned. We are working on countries like Morocco, Pakistan, etc., not Bangladesh so far. That's interesting, very interesting to see how can the global governance enable countries to continue to develop and support them into doing it in a balanced way. So basically, when we do our scenarios, we do not put Bangladesh or Pakistan with negative emissions. By the way, in Pakistan, there is huge potential with the forest, etc. But nevertheless, it's about development. It's about having the right energy, and whether going only to renewables from the beginning is not obvious. So in some cases, there is a need for, or a discussion whether some gas should be useful for 10 years period before everything could be renewable, etc. So the question in these developing countries is really how to manage both the development, access to energy, and in a fair way, in a fair balance, and with the right support also in terms of financing. Then it's about also each individual country. And we work a lot with typically the French Development Agency, who supports a lot of African countries, and where we have real challenges. So when it's about building, well, there is no more coal typically supported in this country, that's a great news. Then going only to renewables right at the beginning is a good challenge. Role of nuclear power can comment shortly. We are not for or against this. We have in our scenarios a participation of nuclear power, which is linked with the local policies. It's not an economic approach to decide nuclear. It's more than economic. It's about acceptability, location, cost, etc. But it's a global question. So what we do there is that we take into account the local policies, not the competitiveness. and indeed, we have a growing nuclear part, and it's practical in terms of decarbonization. So, but we do not just imagine it without taking the commitments of the country. So in Europe, it's decreasing in many countries, and there are some new plans that are planned in Eastern Europe. In Asia, there is a lot in China, etc. So we take it into account. But it is not a tremendous factor. It is participating to supporting the decrease of fossil fuels, but much less than renewables. Richard, do you want to comment something on maybe on developing countries, by the way, too?
Yeah, I think at this stage, it's essential that countries see this as a general shift that more or less all countries in the world are going to have to make, and that as we go along, this will look like a set of opportunities, because the business as usual of remaining high carbon will no longer be acceptable. So in countries like Nigeria, where oil and gas revenues are a significant source of income, we have to tell them this will not continue like this, because even if we are not entirely successful in decarbonizing globally, the price of oil will not be what you expect it to be. The price of gas will not be what you expect it to be, and you certainly will not sell as much of it. So you have to actually embrace that change and anticipate that transition. But in addition, I think private sector folks will see new markets develop around the solutions for low carbon, and that this is going to become sooner or later a kind of new normal. The question is how late are we going to be in making that shift, and how can we best accompany those countries so that they're not left out of that shift? And so the burden is on the development banks and on donors in general to actually accompany that change and bring also technical assistance to ensure that the best policies are being put to bear in those countries to allow those changes. And that's the area where we have to push a lot. I think technology access is probably another one, but I would stay away from saying it's an intellectual property issue. I think it's more a question of having the right capacity and know-how to actually implement those technologies around the world, and not just in OECD and emerging economies.
Thank you. I will conclude while answering the last question, but with two more minutes. One question is what measures to be used to force countries to cut their CO2 emissions. So this is not a question we can answer. What I would say, coming back to what Richard was mentioning, is that looking at the physical results is the job we do every day, which is not always very positive, because we are about the lagging results, what's really happening. When we look at more positives, to me, what can really move the governments and the global governance about this is also the people's expectation. And that's where there are changes. That's where I mentioned also all the different stakeholders, because the pressure on companies, well, typically in Europe, or I think in developed countries, the oil companies, they cannot find new engineers, or they have a tough job at hiring the right people. So at some stage, the pressure is increasing with young people, etc., with my children, your children, etc. So the population, the effort, the expectations of changes is growing. And at some stage, the sociologists say that when you have 10-15% of a population that is really pushing, it's not 2%, and it becomes really to have a snowball effect. So that's a kind of good expectation that will force political discussions and commitments, hopefully. And then about the demand, there is a question on the demand side about whether we have looked into details of the power consumption by the computers. So the answer is no, not yet, but we can send you some documents, and we are just starting quite a big contract with an industrial company that wants to look at a number of drivers on demand change. So not on the sufficiency side, but more on the efficiency side, the IT being one, electrification of uses, etc. So we are going to look in much more detail at this, on what can be some key drivers on power consumption, electrification, that could lead to demand scenarios with a really decreasing demand or a strong effect on this. And the last question I would comment at the end is about what is the projected GDP development to achieve zero net emission? Well, we are not projecting, we are taking GDP forecast into account as the economy today, with all the limits of the GDP calculation, because you have in the GDP, you have food, you have fun, you have a lot of important things, but you have also medicine, you have also different things. So whether the GDP represents development, no, not. There are many discussions about this. Nevertheless, it drives a lot of the activity and it drives a lot of the energy consumption. So we take their assumptions that are quite public, and then the question about what the world can afford in terms of development and energy consumption is still open, obviously, on this side, and that's where we go to sufficiency. Whether we can decouple development, welfare, well-being activities, and so on from energy consumption is the key question for the coming years. So putting indicators there on decoupling, but looking into details by sector, etc., so that the energy consumption is not so much linked with GDP is a key point, is a real key point in the coming months, in the coming years there. And there are interesting experiences in some countries, in some small countries typically, which are good to look at. So I will not wrap up anything. Thank you, Richard, for your messages. Thank you, Morgan and the team, for preparing this. We'll have an update on this. We do it twice a year, so we'll have an update most probably in September, October. We are thinking about going into a larger picture also, sometimes to enlarge the cover all greenhouse gas emissions, to be able to comment this, because it's key to understand all these parts, and we have partners for this, even if we are not experts. And probably we'll come back in the coming months or years on how to go deeper into demand, energy efficiency or energy sufficiency topics, which will be key and which are not so much covered. So thank you for your attention. Sorry for being a little bit delayed, and have a nice day. And I hope to be in touch soon.